Well, it is 7 o'clock here in the UK, and I want to say a very hearty welcome to those who are joining us for the session this evening. Who are the Moravians? It is not unusual that we hear people ask this question as to who Moravians, Moravians are. So as to give then a sense of where we are headed with the program this evening, I'm just going to be giving you an indication of the kinds of topics that we will cover. But I just want to say welcome to those who are joining us, from all over the world as you're joining us. We just want to say how good it is that you can join us this evening for this study. It is not unusual that individuals would raise this question when I say to them, I belong to the Moravian Church. Usually we get the question, which church is that? So it is with a certain amount of experience, really, that I come to this question to raise with individuals who are the Moravians as a way in which to bring out a sense of the history, but also to bring out a sense of the kinds of things with which the Moravians are preoccupied. So I welcome everyone and hope that it will be a good session for us this evening. In terms of the approach that I'm going to be taking to looking at this topic, I am recognizing that the question who the Moravians are, who are the Moravians, there are a number of approaches we can take to dealing with it. A number of approaches we can take. And so as to give a sense of what we may regard as completeness about the consideration of this question, I'm going to look a little bit at Moravian history. I will look a little bit at Moravian geography, and then I will look a little bit at governance. Of course, I should say at the outset that in dealing with a religious organization like the Moravian Church, there are different approaches that one can take in dealing with it. This will be, if you like, a cursory glance and a track through Moravian history designed to give a kind of a 101 understanding of what is this religious community formed, as we know, in the 16th century. So let us begin then with this question of history. Where did it all begin? So in a way, we can say that it all began in Bohemia. All began in the region of the world we now know today as Czechoslovakia, in the old kingdom, the old Bohemian and Moravian kingdom. Life and geography would have been organized somewhat differently from it is today, but the regions of Bohemia and Moravia are the regions that have given birth to the church we call the Unitas Fratrum. You will notice then that the term Moravian really is if you like, it's a geographical term in the sense that it describes the region from which the Moravians in fact came. But in truth and in fact, Moravians is a nickname. That was not the name that was adopted by the church at its formation in 1457. In fact, the church was established in the Kunvat Valley in 1457 under the name the Unity of the Brethren, and from which we get the term the Unitas Fratrum, which is then, if you like, it is the Greek, rather the Latin description of the name of the church, the Unitas Fratrum, and we then say commonly called the Moravians. But why did this church really come to fore? Why did this church emerge? Emerge as, if you like, to become the oldest of the Protestant churches. This is a point to note, that the Moravian Church is the oldest surviving Protestant church. Well, there are a number of things to note then in relation to the emergence of the Moravian Church. In the middle, or if you like, in the high Middle Ages, there were a number of efforts being made in the Roman Catholic Church for reform, a number of initiatives designed to bring about new life within what had come to be described by many as a kind of a dry religion. But there were many of the religious reforms that took place that were contained within the church, but then there were other reforms that, because of their nature, they had to come out of the church in order to survive. So the Moravian Church, or the Unitas Fratrum, really began as a movement within Roman Catholicism. The leader of this movement, or the individual who became a significant leader in this movement, was the one Jan Hus. The Hussite movement, as it is called, was responsible for a number of developments, and there were several groups that were part of the movement. And I'll come in a little later. I will talk about what were some of the main concerns of this movement. But this Hussite movement, which, if you like, it would have developed as a prehistory of what eventually became the Protestant movement, it represented attempts at reform within the church. The church had many flaws, and there were many concerns about morality. There were many concerns about doctrine. There were many concerns also about economy. There were many concerns about what may be regarded as the central things pertaining to the faith. And because of these concerns, there were differences of opinion about how these might express. So when we speak then of the emergence, or when we speak of those things within the church that led to the urge for reform, we also then have to think about power. And what are the groups that were associated with power, so that they were able to defend if you like, the historical, the traditional patterns and beliefs within the church, and what are the groups, therefore, that were not. So Jan Hus, as we are called, born in 1369, he trained as a priest, and he would have served the church in Prague, so to speak. And the chapel that is called Bethlehem Chapel is a place with which he was associated, and he eventually became a rector at the University of Prague. Jan Hus would have been significantly influenced by the writings of John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe himself was one who led a significant challenge to some of the ideas within Roman Catholicism. John Wycliffe raised question about the authority of the papacy, raised question about the integrity of individuals who were leaders within the church, but more importantly, he raised questions about some of the ideas of theology which were held. And Wycliffe was a significant influence for John Hus, and in fact, one of the ways in which John met his fate was because he was not prepared to disassociate himself with some of these ideas and these ideas associated with Wycliffe. Well, after having been imprisoned and promised that he would have received safe carriage, John Hus was brought to the Council of Constance, which was convened in 1415. Now, it so happened that at the time of the convening of this Council of Constance in 1415, there were other problems and other issues that the Roman Catholic Church had to face. It was dealing with an important problem of the papacy itself, in that there were, at that time, there were three individuals that were contending, so to speak, to be pope. And part of the reason why there was this, if you like, power struggle within the papacy, it had to do with those individuals who may have been supported by the political directorate, or individuals who may feel that they were much more supported by the curia, or individuals that they feel they had a greater moral standing, so to speak. So there was a contention between individuals for the papacy. So we may say that John Hus came to trial at a time when there was not really a lot of patience with those things that were challenged in the church. Nevertheless, at the Council of Constance, John Hus was asked to give account, so to speak, of the things which he held and the things that he taught and the things that he believed. He was challenged to recant, that is to say, to turn away from those ideas. We'll come a little bit to some of those ideas, I say, in a moment. But John Hus felt that he could not in good conscience turn away from the ideas that he held. The council felt that because of his unwillingness to give up some of those ideas, because of his obstinacy, and because of his association with Wycliffe, whom they had regarded as someone who was already outside the church and who had to be excommunicated, therefore, by association, so to speak, he himself met a fate. So John Hus was burned at the stake in 1415. He was tied and he was led out and he was put to death. That putting to death of John Hus, in a sense, led to the development of the Hussite movement, because individuals felt that he was unfairly treated, but that also that the church was not giving attention to those things which were of concern to the people in Bohemia and Moravia. If we were to go to Prague today, you would see a statue of John Hus, in a sense, because he is regarded as someone who he is regarded as a national hero, so to speak, in Prague or in Czechoslovakia, and no doubt he's associated with the urge to reform, and reform not only the religious life, but the social and political life of the country were associated with the emergence of John Hus. The main concerns, if you like, of the main issues that would have been associated with the Hussite movement is what we call the Articles of Prague. The Articles of Prague, if you like, were the ideals, those things which were believed to be the foundational things around which the Hussite movement would have been associated. So the sale of indulgences was iniquitous and should be outlawed, and the priests should be punished. The issue of the sale of indulgences, of course, relates to the economic life of the Catholic Church. We do know that although there were places in the Catholic Church where there were very rich individuals and rich parishes, there were other places where they were struggling financially. And the sale of indulgences, that is to say, the allowance for money to be paid with the assurance of forgiveness of sins, is something which was found to be a way in which revenue could be collected. The Hussite movement felt under the Articles of Prague that this was inconsistent with what was the desired ideal, for the Christian faith. The other idea, of course, that they held was that the sacrament of Holy Communion, or the Holy Sacrament, that they felt it was to be celebrated in two kinds. That is to say, the bread and the wine being given, because in their view, that is how it was given to all the, this is what Christ desired for the for all Christians who come, that they should receive the body and the blood. Part of the reason why the communion in one kind, or the sacrament in one kind, had developed had to do with certain practices in the Middle Ages, and it was felt that for relating to the, if you like, the safety and the health and safety of the body, of the elements, so to speak, the blood or the wine would not normally be given to the rank and file. The priest would have both kinds, but the people would receive only one kind. Even today, within the Roman Catholic Church, it is still the practice where the communion in two kinds, so the body and the blood for the priest, but communion in one kind, only the bread for other individuals. The third area of concern for the church was what may be regarded as who was head of the church, and this now especially was important, not least because of the struggle, the power struggle that was in the church as to who was the Pope, really, which Pope was the right Pope. Will the right Pope please stand up? The Hussite movement emphasized that the church had only one head, and that was Christ. It also went on to affirm that the authority of Scripture should take precedence over the other authorities within the church. These issues from Prague, and these issues associated with the Hussite movement, you will notice, they became important in the Lutheran Reformation, which took place some 60 years after. So this is an important point in that sense to make. Although the Moravian Church is a pre-Reformation church, that's to say pre-Lutheran Reformation, we say of the Moravian Church, it belongs to the early Reformation. Many people do not often refer to the Hussite revolution or the Reformation in this 15th century to 16th century as an important part, but we can see that the development in the Hussite Reformation, that in a sense it created somewhat of a foundation, of a pathway, of an example, which the subsequent Lutheran Reformation was able to fall into. So in 1457, a number of Moravians came together, and they established the Moravian Church as a separate church, because in their view, it was not possible to be housed, so to speak. They felt that they were ill at home. They were not at home within a church that was not prepared to address the issues with which they were concerned. And so one of the early leaders, significant leaders of the Moravian Church after its formation was the Czech Petr Chelsiky, and he was known for his a strong emphasis on pacifism, and this became an important hallmark within the Moravian Church as it developed. There was also an emphasis in these early Moravian Church that they should see themselves as being separate over against the world. This became a very detrimental conception for the church later on, in the sense that there was an inclination to emphasize separateness to the extent that engagement with the world was something that was put in question. Nevertheless, Chelsiky was of that ilk, and so he emphasized. Another important individual within the early church was one Gregory the Patriarch, and he was, if there is if you like, a commencement within the Moravian tradition of this idea of modesty, that is to say, not making such strong assertions about the individual, but in a sense, making the individual to be at all times to be much more focused on how they live a servant life in relation to Christ. Gregory the Patriarch was one who inserted into this Moravian narrative this idea of modesty. Luke of Prague is probably the earliest of the theologians of the Moravian Church. That is, those who were very careful in terms of how they articulated the ideas of the Moravian Church. Luke of Prague, of course, was a contemporary also of Luther, and also had conversation with individuals with the Lutheran movement. It is in Luke of Prague we see a much more intentional turn towards within this Moravian narrative of being much more engagement with the world. And there is a sense that there should be toleration and openness. In other words, allow for different views to contend. And it is within this time of Luther of Prague that we have developing what became a very important, if you like, defining moment, or something that defines the center of Moravian life, where it says, in essentials unity, in non-essentials liberty, in all things charity, because it is in this early designation, and we'll come to that later, in this early designation, there was a distinction made between the things that were essential for the faith, the things that were ministerial in the sense that they served the essentials, and then they talk about the things that were the incidentals. In other words, the things which technically could be done without, because they were much more relegated to time and place, and they were not part of the essential. So in Luke of Prague, we have this early development. Then we come to John Amos Comenius, who by far is probably, apart from Zinzendorf, is probably the best known Moravian, certainly because of the strength of his education reform and the popularity of these, and because of his own contribution to educational life. John Amos Comenius is well known. He is believed to have been approached by certainly by Harvard, and certainly by the Education Authority in Denmark, that he would become head of their education program, and certainly chancellor. The war years in England were part of the reason why Amos Comenius and his own engagement in a sense in the mid 17th century, because of his own inability to give up his own focus. He did not maintain that engagement with the educators in England. However, his work, and he has written copious philosophical and educational works for which he is known, and in many regards he is regarded as the father of modern education, not least because he put a lot of emphasis on how to teach children to acquire, to read, and also because of his emphasis on how languages should be taught. But with these, his educational reform, his political reform, and his theological reform are things with which he was associated. And Comenius is probably the individual from whom the Moravian tradition would have inherited this idea of being very strong in their ecumenical engagement, because he was concerned with church unity. And his concern was that the factions within the church that had reason to be warring, that they would find a way to overcome their disunity. Well, it is also in Comenius that we find this emphasis on being able to work with people of other religious traditions. He had this idea that if God has revealed himself to the Muslims, for example, if they say that God has revealed himself to them, that the onus was on us to ensure that we engage with them as a way of ensuring that we would not be, in a sense, overlooking something that God, in fact, has decreed. So he was very strong in his insistence that we should engage with people of other religious traditions, because if we do not, we might be found to be disobeying God. And speaking of ecumenism, in a sense, Communis marks the transition, if you like, from the early Moravian Church to what may be regarded as the New Moravian Church. The New Moravian Church is associated more so with Count Zinzendorf. He was born just a few years after. He was born just a few years after Comenius died. Excuse me, and he. So he represented, if you like, the turn to the new Moravian community. Well, how did all that came about? Well, the time of Comenius, in fact, for much of his years, he was part of what was known as, he experienced what was known as the counter, in that sense, the counter-reformation, because of the efforts that were within the Roman Catholic Church to, in a sense, to claw back at some of the things which had happened, to bring about the sense of tension, but also to question the authority of the church. And so there was a very strong effort to stamp out anything that looked like dissent. And the Moravians in Bohemia and Moravia, they were significantly impacted by this counter-reformation. Hundreds of the ministers were put to death, and certainly many individuals lost their lives because of the effort to stamp out dissent. It remained within the Moravian tradition, so to speak, that they really needed to find a place where it would be possible that they would be able to live and conduct their lives freely in accordance with their faith. So when Comenius died, he died with in about 1670. He died with a hope that there would come a time when there would be a rebirth within the Moravian community. Well, he did not, of course, live to see the rebirth. The rebirth happened sometime, effectively some 50 years after he died. It started happening because the Moravians were led to believe that in Germany there was a much more supportive atmosphere or accommodating atmosphere for the kinds of religious expressions that they wanted to portray. It was during what we call the Pietistic movement or the Pietistic revolution within the Lutheran Church that had been established by this time, this movement in Pietism, which was a lot of emphasis on the relationship, what may be regarded as the relationship with the personal relationship that the believer would have with Christ. There was a lot of emphasis on it called the heart religion. And it is in this context of the development of the heart religion that Zinzendorf, or if you like, that we had Zinzendorf, he emerged within that. He himself was a Lutheran cleric, and he was also the owner of an estate in the eastern part of Germany, and he becoming aware of these migrants, if you like, as they were moving out of Moravia, coming through Poland and coming into eastern Germany. He was one who, being sympathetic, being very much influenced by his own pietistic training, having studied at the University of Halle, which was one of the centers of pietism in Germany, he gave accommodation to these migrants as they were moving in. So, if you like, the renewed Moravian Church was a church that began as a migrant church. if you like, was a place where individuals who, for all intents and purposes, came as refugees and found a place to stay on the estate belonging to Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf. He was related to the royal family in Denmark, and he himself was a very influential individual. He studied law, but he also was a cleric, and he on his estate near what is now known as Bethelsdorf, not far from Leipzig in Germany, but in the community that's called Herrenhut. Zinzendorf accommodated these individuals on his estate. That community of individuals which were accommodated on this estate by Zinzendorf is the community, in a sense, that connects the old Moravian with what became the new Moravian Church, which moved out of Europe and moved towards the Americas, the Caribbean, and Africa. So Zinzendorf, he had an important role to play in this transition. He himself came to England, and he was instrumental in establishing or seeing to the registration of the Moravian Church as an ancient Episcopal church. In a sense, he took advantage of his own class to ensure that the Moravian Church as a religious community would have been registered in the UK. However, the critical thing about the Moravians as we come to the early 1700s was that the community in Herrenhut, which was formed, came to question what may be regarded as their role in the world and their place in the world, and how were they to give expression to these religious convictions that they had. Zinzendorf heard about the existence in the Danish colonial world in the Caribbean. He became aware of individuals of African descent who had been brought by the colonial powers, so in this regard, by Denmark. So we had Denmark, Holland, Spain, Portugal, and Britain were the leading individuals who were, in that sense, involved at that time in the trading of Africans. This of course colonial period is something which is significant, if you like. The period of enslavement is significant for the character that has developed within the Moravian Church, because the first individuals to whom the Moravians were to go to initiate or to lead into religious life, so to speak, were individuals who were of African descent in the Caribbean. Now, the involvement of the Moravians in the Caribbean is something, indeed, that is not at all times that left with necessarily an extremely complimentary history, because some of the ways in which they became involved were such that they were themselves part of the class. They were supported by the planters, and they had to work at the behest of the planters, and also in their work. Certainly at instances in St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands, and instances in St. Elizabeth in Jamaica, and certainly in many instances in Suriname, they themselves became holders of enslaved Africans. And this is something which is certainly a blotch on the Moravian history. And the fact that it was much worse in the Church of England is not something which in any way should those who are passionate about the Moravian movement should blush, because in truth and in fact, it is something which has caused quite a bit of embarrassment. Happily, it did not last long, and by the time we came, of course, to the 1834, abolition had taken place, and of course, it was without question that the individuals who were held in an enslaved way had to be given up. But this is something that Moravians, in a sense, has to come to terms with, not only in terms of its involvement in Jamaica, but certainly its involvement in Suriname, something which needs to be remembered. However, it is also not to be taken for granted the way in which the Moravians have otherwise contributed to the development of social life, because part of the critical contribution that was made is a contribution to education. Indeed, in 1854, when the Moravians had been in Jamaica already for about 100 years, for example, they were with about 13,000 individuals as part of the community in Jamaica. They were already responsible for the operation of some 45 primary schools. And that, in a sense, indicated the strong emphasis on education, which was part of the part of the ethic of their involvement. So from Prague, if you like, from Prague through to Germany, in a sense, we see, or if you like, from Bohemia, Moravia to Germany, and then out to the New World, we get an idea of what the Moravian history is like. Well, what can we say about in terms of where then the Moravians are located? So we turn now to do a little bit of geography. Where are they located today, having had that history? Well, we refer to the Moravian as a worldwide unity, and they are what we call 25 what we call independent provinces. And these independent provinces are located significantly in Tanzania, in Eastern Africa, but also in the Caribbean, in North America, and in South America, in continental Europe, and also in what we call in South Africa, as well as in Northwest and Northeastern Africa. So these are some 25 provinces, so which are independent provinces throughout the world. We say they are independent, self-governing provinces, and I have the indication there of the years in which these provinces would have been established. Alaska, 1885, American North in 1741, American South in 1754, Britain and Ireland in 1742, the Czech province, 1457, the Congo in 2010, Costa Rica in 1980, Europe continental in 1722, East and West Indies in 1732, Guyana in 2016, Honduras in 1930, Jamaica in 1754, and so on. So it is an indication of the time when the work began in these areas. So, but apart from these, what we may call self-governing provinces that are all over the world, we have what we also know as mission provinces. And they refer to as mission provinces because they are not yet altogether independent and self-governing. And these provinces are indicated in Labrador, in Honduras. A part of the work in the Czech Republic now comes under a unity as a mission province, and then we have the church in Burundi, and more recently the church in Cuba. But the Moravians are not only confined to these areas. As a church that puts a lot of emphasis on mission, there is now what we may call the mission areas, and there are areas where there is an attempt to establish and to house new efforts. So Albania, in Guyana, in Honduras, in Belize, in Rwanda, in Kenya, Uganda, in South Asia, Sierra Leone, Zanzibar, Tanzania, and in several places in Tanzania. So these are areas where we call the mission areas. So if you like, then we have the self-governing provinces, we have the mission provinces, and we have the mission areas as important part of what the church is today. So we have looked then at geography, and we have also looked a little bit of history, and now we come to look a little bit at what we call doctrine. What are some of the things that the Moravians emphasize? What are some of the things that they believe? We say of the church, it's an evangelical, ecumenical church, and this emphasis on evangelism and ecumenism are important for the self-understanding. This self-understanding of the church is captured in what we call the motto of the church. And by this motto, what we mean is a description that somehow attempts to define an attitude, the attitude which we believe should be characteristic of how we deal with issues of theology and issues of practice in the world today. In essentials, unity; in non-essentials, liberty; in all things, charity. What in a sense it's emphasized that there are some things, some doctrinal statements that are important for the unity, important for the church and for the faith, and in these things there's a call that there should be unity. But then there are those things which are not believed to be essential for the faith, or if you like, they are ministerials. They serve the faith, but they're not essential. So, for example, whether or not we worship in a building of a certain structure, whether or not we worship on a Saturday or a Sunday, or whether or not we have ordained or not ordained ministers. These things are referred to as ministerial things. They are, if you like, in this word, they're non-essential. They do not belong to the core of what it means to belong to the faith. They are important, but they're not essential. And then, of course, there are other things that we may say are things in which there should be absolute, there should be no insistence, really, that they should be in any way a stumbling block to the relationship between the churches. And so the Moravians say, in all things, love. So this defines the attitude to doctrine. It defines the attitude to service. It also defines the attitude to practice. But there's something else that is doctrinally important for the Moravians, and that is the idea that the Moravians should be involved in service to the world. This is important. Should be involved in service to the world, because if you like, how else do we communicate the apostolic faith other than living the apostolic faith, showing what it is? So you'll find that in all the places where the Moravians are doing work, there's an emphasis on educational, vocational training. There's also an emphasis on healthcare. There's an emphasis on history and heritage, and there's also an emphasis on agriculture, depending on where, in fact, the work is located. So it's another way of saying the faith is not only something to be believed; it is something to be practiced. So one of the ways then in which we refer to Moravian Church is that it is ecumenical. We'll come in a little moment to look at what we call the episcopal nature of the church, but just to emphasize what we call the doctrinal position. It is evangelical because of what it says should be the engagement with the world. And we say it is ecumenical because of how it should engage with other people who are on the same journey of faith. You Moravians are very accommodating and very willing to work with people of other religious traditions and other Christian traditions, because we say it is part of what it means to serve Christ in the world. But there's also an emphasis, what we call on the the way in which the historical and traditional way in which there is the description of the Christian faith as a Trinitarian faith, where the emphasis is put on Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as part of the way in which God has revealed himself in the world. So in this regard, the Moravians are not unique. They're part of if you like, a whole swathe of religious groups who affirm these. But we may say the particular uniqueness of the Moravian Church relates to its own history and some aspects of its own practice. Before I wrap up, then, I must deal a little bit with what we call governance in the Moravian Church. How does governance happen? There are three levels, if you like, at which we are to understand the governance within the church. We understand governance in terms of the worldwide governance. We understand governance in terms of the regional governance, or if you like, the governance at the national or the provincial level. And then we have governance at what we call the smaller units at the congregational level. Representatives of all the provinces come together to form what we call the Unity Synod, which meets every 7 years. In this regard, the Moravian Church is, in a sense, maintaining part of its own tradition. In fact, there is no other, we may say, Protestant church that is governed by a single worldwide authority. Most Protestant churches are governed by regional authority, and there is no automatic authority that is given to the national level. So we think, for example, of the Lambeth Conference for the Church of Ireland. It is certainly an important authoritative position that it holds in relation to the worldwide Anglican Communion, but each diocese, so to speak, has a way of being responsible for, in a sense, each province for its own authority. Well, within the Moravian Church, there is a worldwide unity board, and there is a worldwide synod that meets every 7 years. At the national or provincial level, we may say that we have this aggregation of authority, where each province has what is called a provincial synod, usually meeting every 2 years in most places, and that's where representatives of all the congregations come together with the clergy and the executive board, which we call the Provincial Elders Conference, which we use the designation PEC. They come together and they constitute the provincial synod, and that provincial synod has responsibility for the enunciation of and of those rules and the regulations and positions that must then govern the whole province. So, if you like, we mentioned the 25 independent province. Each of them would have their own synod, which then has the authority over the respective province. But each provincial synod must find itself to be in step with and in line with what is called the Unity Synod, in order to ensure consistency and to avoid confusion. Each congregation at the local level, each congregation has what we call an administrative body. In some places, it's a single administrative body called a church committee. In other places, it may be 2 administrative bodies, one looking at the matters relating to finance and property, the other looking more at the issues relating to worship and membership care. But certainly in the British province, it is a single committee that is responsible with the minister for the oversight of the work of the local congregation. So there is a certain, what we call, there is a collegiality, or if you like, a conciliar, a council approach to how the church is governed. A council at the international level, a council at the provincial level, and a council or committee at the local congregational level. Another important part of the if you like, of the governance of the church has then to do with its own ministry. How is ministry authorized and within the church? Not unlike certainly the historic or the older Protestant churches, the Moravian observe what we call a threefold order of ministry: deacon, presbyter, and bishop. And for the most part, in most provinces, after a minimum of 1 year, and in some places a maximum of 5 years, in some places, or even in 5 years, an individual will serve as a deacon, having been ordained by a bishop, because only a bishop is authorized to do ordination. The consecration as a presbyter, in a sense, is a recognition of the maturity that the deacon has come to, and that individual is then consecrated to the second order, or if you like, the second level of ministry. It's not referred to as ordination, but in a sense, it's referred to as consecration, because in a sense, it's a confirming for the deacon, a recognition of his own or her own role and maturity in ministry. Those who are elected bishops usually are elected from among the presbyters, and each province will have at least one bishop, though today most provinces will have several. The bishop serves as bishop for life. He does not lose his office as bishop. He may certainly, or she may certainly retire, but the role as bishop remains, symbolizing the unity of the church, symbolizing the unity and symbolizing also the authority in that sense. So we say the symbol bishop is a symbol of unity, and one of the ways in which we describe the bishops, we say they are pastor to pastors in that sense. The Moravian understanding of ministry and the Moravian understanding of bishop is something which is the envy of some other churches, because the Moravians have found a way to make a distinction between what we may say management of the affairs of the church on a day-to-day basis and pastoral oversight. So we find that the provincial elders council are the ones, that's the body that is responsible for day-to-day management and oversight of the affairs of the church. In general, the bishop are the ones who have the responsibility, so to speak, to strengthen and give attention to the pastoral oversight. Apart from the ordained ministry, individuals may also be appointed to what we call lay ministries. And in this regard, different provinces may have different names and emphasis, but what we may say it's an appointed ministry. So two orders of ministry: we have the ordained ministry, deacon, presbyter, bishop, or we have the appointed ministers that are usually done. They may be appointed nationally, or they may be appointed at the congregation. So then we have taken a kind of a trip through several things. We have looked at Moravian history. We have looked at the geography. We have looked at the practice. And we have looked at now matters relating to governance. Well, to close, let me just share with you then the images, certainly for those of us who are in the British province, and certainly in Ireland. Just to give you an idea, we have churches at Ballinderry, at Kilwallen, at Grace Hill, at University Road, Belfast, and at Cliftonville, or on the Old Park Road in Belfast. So only 5 churches in Northern Ireland. But that, in a sense, is an indication of the, if you like, the size of the church in general worldwide. In England, we have maybe about 30 congregations in England. And so the British province would be one of the smaller provinces worldwide. But in places like America, or in Suriname, or in the Caribbean, and certainly in Tanzania, there are many, many more. They're much larger, and the churches there are ever growing. So who are the Moravians? That's the question we wanted to answer this evening. Who are the Moravians? The Moravians, it's a church. It's an old church. It is the first of the Protestant churches, but also we may say it is a worldwide, evangelical, welcoming, and ecumenical church. I thank you very much for listening, and I hope there were things that were brought to your attention which you otherwise would not have known. Goodbye. Thank you very much.